here?
George didn't have stellar attendance.
Good to go? Okay. So, this morning, topic is, I struggle with a title for it. Here?
George didn't have stellar attendance.
Good to go? Okay. So, this morning, topic is, I struggle with a title for it, but I call it Innovations in Potato Fertility. It's going to be a combination of a bit of a refresher on some of the basics of potato fertility, but then also, some of the results of new research and new trials and all that sort of stuff as well. There's, as always, in these types of meetings, lots of time for questions, lots of time for discussion, so please feel free to do so. And then at the end, we're going to have a short session led by Don Binns here, who's going to be helping us get some of your feedback in terms of the role of the board and the state of the industry, and as part of our strategic planning process. So looking forward to getting, hopefully you can stay for that. It's not going to be super long, but we want to get some of your feedback as part of our strategic planning process. So I'll get rolling. Just had a, so Daryl pointed out right away, what's the light green strips? The light green strips was a plug shoe on the planter, and no fertilizer got down at planting. This is just, I call it an accidental trial with a grower. And what we did is, so where you saw those light green strips, he got only a little bit of pre-plant nitrogen, no phosphorus, and probably half the normal amount of K, which was spread on ahead. So about 100 K probably and about 40 N. What's interesting is where I went in and took samples in those green strips later, light green strips. There's only about 20-25 hundredweight difference between them. Does that mean everybody goes and plants potatoes with 40 nitrogen and 100 K? No, it doesn't. But what it means is that we get more from the soil on some of those nutrients than we think we do sometimes. And that is part of what we're going to talk about today. Becky, I'll sit in that with you and then pass it around. All right. So, main thing I'm going to talk about today is some of the main macronutrients that we need for plants. Of course, we get the CH and O, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen comes from water and organic matter and is pretty readily available most of the time. Your NP and K, everybody's really familiar with. Your calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are also macronutrients used in less amounts, much less amounts than the top three. And then your micronutrients, boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc. The ones that we're most worried about in potatoes for the most part is usually boron, manganese, and zinc, especially boron and zinc because they tend to be a bit lacking in PEI soils. But we're going to spend most of our focus on these top 6 today, okay? The one we spend the most time on, because it's probably the most complex, is nitrogen. So what does nitrogen do? We all know we need nitrogen to grow a crop of potatoes, to grow anything in agriculture. What does it do? Well, it's a major component of chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is, of course, the main, the essential molecule for photosynthesis. You can see that's a chlorophyll molecule down there. There's 4 ends in it, in the middle of it, right? All these carbons on the outside. There's 4 ends in the middle, and in the very middle is 1 atom of magnesium. So those are essential nutrients. It's also an essential component in most amino acids, which form the proteins, and the proteins are, essential to just about everything in a plant's operations. It's also part of the energy transfer compounds ATP and ADP. For people that maybe remember high school biology or even university biology, ATP and ADP is the complex that moves energy in and out of the cells. Basically, that's all you need to know. It loses an atom, or a molecule, adds a molecule. That's how it moves energy in and out of the cell. And then, of course, it's a component of RNA and DNA, which are the building blocks of life. So the tricky part about nitrogen in potatoes is that, unlike some other crops, like, say, corn or wheat or canola, too much nitrogen doesn't really hurt yield in those crops, on average. Like, too much nitrogen on corn, you may be wasting some nitrogen, but you're not really going to affect the yield too much. In wheat, you may get more lodging and some things like that. That's a problem. But if you're just being economically inefficient, you're not really hurting the crop. But in potatoes, too much nitrogen is a problem. And too much nitrogen is associated with delayed maturity. The plant stays greener longer, and so that delays tuberization, delays tuber set, delays maturity, and delays bulking. And in our short growing season, that's more of an issue than it is in, say, Pacific Northwest United States or something where they would have a longer growing season. So if you only have a 130, 140 day growing season, or if you're growing seed, let's say, and you want to get it done in 90 to 100 days, we can't have potatoes still rank green at the end of the season because that's going to delay that tuberization, okay? On the other side of that, of course, not enough nitrogen, then of course, yeah, we get reduced yield, reduced plants with reduced vigor and health that are more susceptible to other pests and diseases. Managing end in season is difficult with most crops. It's difficult with potatoes unless we're doing fertigation. Again, that's what they're doing in most of the states. There are some foliar products that some of you probably are already using that deliver small amounts at a time that can top up and make up some of that difference if you find that you are short late in the season. But really what we want to talk about today is we want to talk about amount, but also making sure that the amount that we do apply is available at the right time. Because with potatoes especially, they need the nitrogen later in the season. They don't need it all up front. They don't need it at planting time. They need it 60, 70, 80 days after planting. They don't need it 10, 20 days after planting. So nitrogen is probably the most complex nutrient to understand in plant nutrition because it comes in so many different forms and we get nitrogen in so many different ways, right? So this is a basic outline of the nitrogen cycle. We get nitrogen in multiple ways, right? So we can get it from the atmosphere, and the plants don't take it up from the atmosphere, but if you get a lot of thunderstorms, lightning hits the air and it turns N2, which is gaseous nitrogen, into NO2, which goes to the ground and then turns into nitrate, which is then taken up by plants. But that amount in a year, depending on the amount of thunderstorms you have, is like 10, 15 pounds an acre, something like that. So it's not a big amount, and it's nothing we'd ever really bank on. Then of course, you've got your regular fertilizers, which come in many forms. If you're applying urea and you're applying it on the surface of the soil and you don't have an inhibitor, it can be lost through volatilization to the air, ammonia lost to the air. Same as manure, if it's all high in ammonia, it can lose to the air. You've got your animal manures and biosolids that then break down and release ammonium to the soil. You've got your basic organic matter that breaks down and releases nitrogen to the soil. You get biological fixation by legumes, so your alfalfas and clovers and soybeans and other legumes that fix nitrogen, either to supply to themselves, but also usually to supply extra to the soil. And these all most of them go first to ammonium, and then the nitrification process turns them from ammonium into nitrate. Plants can uptake both ammonium and nitrate, but they mostly uptake nitrate. It's the most available form. And so if you apply straight nitrate or mostly nitrate to a field, it's most available. It's almost 100% available to the crop. The only problem is it's also the most vulnerable to loss. So under wet soil conditions, nitrate can be denitrified and turned into nitrous oxide, which is something we talk about a lot more these days in greenhouse gases and stuff. Nitrous oxide is like 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So even just little bits of it makes a big difference, but it's a loss to the system. Same with if we get a lot of rain in the spring or a lot of rain in the fall and there's excess nitrogen in the soil, it can be lost as nitrate going down in the water, right? Going down to the soil. And that's going to groundwater or surface water, and we don't want that either. So, as you can see, it's a complex system, and there's lots of sources and lots of exits from the industry, from the system. So that's just basically what I was talking about. As I said, they only take up ammonium and nitrate, and they mostly take up nitrate. So it's about managing nitrate release at the time that you want it, and not all up front. So as we're talking about how do we build a nitrogen rate and a fertilizer blend, there's lots of questions we need to keep in mind. How much does the crop need according to your yield goal? How much nitrogen will be available from the organic matter itself? How much will be available from if you had a previous legume crop or a previous crop? How much is available from manure or compost if you're using manure or compost? And then what's the timing of that availability? When is it going to be available to the crop? So let's just talk about base needs first. Essentially, every 50 hundredweight of potatoes needs 25 pounds of nitrogen. That's a pretty simple, easy rule. 400 hundredweight needs 200 pounds an acre of nitrogen available, okay? And by available, that's what it needs to grow the tubers, and that's going to be exported from the field in the tubers. And then it needs this other 80 in the above ground. That above ground isn't leaving the field, those plants aren't leaving the field, and they're returning to the soil, but we also know that a lot of the nitrogen that we have after harvest doesn't stay in the system. It's more vulnerable to loss. So we don't necessarily count on a lot of this 80 being around next year in the next crop. But we definitely need about 200 pounds an acre of nitrogen to grow that crop. But as I say below, that's what it needs to grow the crop, but it doesn't account for losses, it doesn't account for nitrogen efficiency, variety efficiency, all those sort of things. So there's a lot we have to kind of keep in mind. You're going to need access to more than 200 from all sources, but we need to figure out what those sources are and how much they're contributing. So how much nitrogen we get from the soil organic matter? If you went just by what the soil lab gives you right now as recommendations, if you use the PEI soil lab and you had a field that was over 3.5% organic matter, they'd say that gives you a 15 pound an acre nitrogen credit. That recommendation's old. That's probably about as old as me. So it hasn't really been updated in quite a while. A&L is a little more generous. They say on a sandy loam soil at 1.5% organic matter that you'd get 30 pounds an acre of nitrogen. But some of the more recent research that's been done here in PEI with people like David Burton over at DAL AC and Kyra here with the department has been able to show that by using this newer test, which is the BNA test, the biological nitrogen availability, this measures the potential and the amount of nitrogen that will mineralize over the next growing season. And what they've been able to see with a number of trials and a number of tests from all over the island is that we're actually probably more like 50, 60 or more pounds an acre of nitrogen that's available to next year's crop from end mineralization. And of course that changes with how high this BNA number. If the BNA number in your organic matter is low, that number's lower. If it's high, that number's higher. We're still working on calibrating and refining this, and it's probably a little bit premature for us to say we can give you, a really strong recommendation based on your DNA, how much nitrogen you get from that. What I want you to recognize is that there is mineralization of nitrogen coming from your organic matter every year. Every year your organic matter breaks down a little bit and adds a little bit. Hopefully, it's adding as much as it breaks down. In some cases we know it doesn't, but hopefully you're at least adding as much organic matter, replacing the organic matter that naturally breaks down every year. And when organic matter breaks down every year, it mineralizes nitrogen. So that is, but understanding how much of it is mineralizing is a work in progress. What I want to leave you with today on this is there is some here. And particularly if you're on a strong organic matter field, you will want to credit something for nitrogen from your organic matter. Because if you don't, you may end up with too much nitrogen late in the season, especially for your late bulking varieties. If we talk about legumes, so again, the recommendations in the textbook or on the sheet, on the fact sheet, are all over the map. So if we go to the PEI lab, and again, these recommendations are old, they're saying if you had a good stand of alfalfa, they don't really say what good means. My idea of good and your idea of good may be different. But they're saying a good stand of alfalfa is worth about 70 pounds an acre of nitrogen. And a fair stand is half of that. And then they say that 1 year red clover is worth about half of alfalfa, and then 2nd year clover is worth about half the 1st year of clover. Okay, that's the PEI recommendation. You go to Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, they're saying that even just half or more of any legume in a stand can be worth up to about 100 pounds an acre of nitrogen. And that, you know, a little bit poorer stand or a little bit less legume in the mix is worth about half that. Perennia, this is the Nova Scotia, basically their replacement for the Department of Agriculture. This is fairly new work that they've done, and they've got a fact sheet on this, which I can provide you copies of if you want. But theirs is all based on the amount of biomass, so how much biomass you grew in the year before, and then that and what variety and what crop and what's coming in next year. But they've got basically a range from 20 to 100 pounds an acre of nitrogen in credit. So you can see we got a big swath trying to understand this. And it depends on when that was terminated, and it depends on what crop's coming next. That also depends on what kind of credit you're getting. So this is a map that I borrowed from this Perennia fact sheet, and the link's here if anybody wants it after. I can send it to you. The black line represents fall-killed red clover, and it's saying that fall-killed red clover would have the maximum nitrogen release compared to these other options, right? So it's the standard, and everything else is compared to that standard. So this is only on a relative scale here. It isn't pounds per acre or anything like that. But what it's showing here is that when you terminate that crop and what that crop is will have a difference in terms of when that nitrogen is released. So fall-killed alfalfa, that's say killed, like a lot of you now are spraying it in August and putting in a cover crop after it in early September, mid-September, that sort of thing. That early fall termination of that clover or alfalfa starts to clock earlier on mineralizing nitrogen. If you wait until spring, or if you waited until late fall and say plowed it when it was, you know, November or something, when it's cold, soil's cold, and there's not going to really be any breakdown, that clock starts later. And things like alfalfa and clover mineralizes a little bit faster, but alfalfa particularly, it takes 9 or 10 months to fully mineralize. So that's why you see here, if I've got fall-killed red clover, in the spring, on my winter wheat that was planted last fall, there's only about 30% of the nitrogen from that crop is available to winter wheat. And that's why we would say you'd have a very limited nitrogen credit from your clover with the winter wheat that went in right after the clover, because it just doesn't have enough time to mineralize. But even by the time that we're planting barley or wheat or canola or something in the spring, we're up to about 60% of the credit. And then when we get to corn, which is in the summer, and corn is very similar in the timing and the amount of uptake as potatoes. Corn and potatoes take about the same amount of nitrogen, and they mineralize, and the timing of uptake is very similar. So it's a good proxy for potatoes. You can see that we get up to almost as 90–100% in the summer. Okay, early summer, June, July, that sort of thing. That's when that mineralization really peaks, mineralization. But you can see that stuff that was killed in the spring, it's only about 50% available to the corn. So if you're doing the math on your farm and you're saying, okay, I've got clover that I killed in the fall versus clover that I killed in the spring, you're probably going to have half the credit, half the nitrogen credit for the stuff that was killed in the spring than the stuff that was killed in the fall. And the problem with this stuff is it hits peak mineralization in the late summer, early fall. And that may be when you actually don't want all that nitrogen, because really late in the fall, when your potatoes are trying to bulk, it doesn't actually need as much nitrogen. It needs to start dying and start putting its own resources into bulking the potatoes. It needs water, but it doesn't really need that much nitrogen. And so this can be the problem. I know some of you have had Burbanks that you get to September and they're still pretty green and they're still pretty small and they're, having a hard time bulking. Well, that's sometimes what's going on there, is they're almost too green, too long. And that's why some people have gotten away from legumes and potatoes, because I'm worried about the timing of that nitrogen release. It's too hard to predict. Well, it can be hard to predict, but it's easier to predict if you kill it in the fall versus killing it and earlier in the fall than late fall or early spring. The other one I want to draw your attention to is this dashed line. that is oilseed radish planted as a cover crop the year before. So again, oilseed radish doesn't fix nitrogen, but it scavenges nitrogen. And then it takes it up, and then, yes, it doesn't survive in the spring, but you can see it just sort of slowly releases, and you even get about 20% of the nitrogen credit of clover by the summertime. So let's say, if I was saying that the nitrogen credit from clover was 50 pounds an acre, I'm getting 10 from the last year's cover crop. So there is a nitrogen release benefit to those cover crops as well. Does this make sense? Anybody questions? Take my vest off, too hot.
Yesterday there's not quite a few, but there's a number of questions on this, so like,
Yeah.
all questions
I know.
are welcome.
Who's seen this kind of a graph before? Anybody? No? Okay. So the timing of the release of the nitrogen is important. And it's also the question we had yesterday a lot at both sessions was, where does the nitrogen come from in those clover crops or in those alfalfa crops? And it's not coming, majority is not coming from the above ground biomass. It's coming from below ground, right? It's coming from the roots, and it's coming from the nodules and the nodulation of the nitrogen that it makes. And that nitrogen is more stable and takes time to mineralize. The nitrogen from the above ground, well, yeah, that stuff's going to be gone fairly quickly unless you plant a cover crop to help, take some of it up. But the proportion of nitrogen coming from that is way smaller than what's coming from the above ground roots and nodules, okay? So that's why we had the conversation about, well, should I, is it a problem if I use glyphosate Roundup on my alfalfa and then put a cover crop in, or should I just Roundup it? And I said, well, you can just Roundup it, and yeah, you will lose some of the nitrogen out of the above ground biomass, but that cover crop will help soak some of it up, and it will help carry some of it over to next year that would be lost otherwise. If you just plowed it green into the ground and you don't put a cover crop on, you will lose some of that.
And is there any difference on what the cover crop will soak up? The previous crop that was in there, whether it be grass or alfalfa or...
Well, basically the amount of nitrogen in the previous crop is more or less a factor of biomass. It's less depending on what it was species-wise. It's probably more how much of it there was. So if it was a heavy crop of stuff you're plowed in versus a light crop of stuff, that would be the difference in the amount of above ground nitrogen that you're trying to keep hold on to. So, as I said, we're still trying to dial this in a bit for PEI. This is a big, we still have a lot of questions. You saw that range of recommendations from other places and from PEI is huge. And it's usually based on research from a bunch of years ago. So we're trying to dial this in a little bit. So I have a project under the New Living Labs project where we're looking at different legume species, different timings of termination, with or without a cover crop, and then different fertilizer rates in the potato year after to try and dial in how much nitrogen credit I get from alfalfa. How much, if I plant alfalfa and I terminate it in the end of August and I put a cover crop in the 15th of September, how much nitrogen credit do I get? Versus if I did it later, and didn't put a cover crop in, how much would I get? Those are some of the questions we're trying to answer. So I have the plan to do this over 3 or 4 years. We just did the setup year on the first 4 fields last year, and they'll be in potatoes this year. And then our plan is to set up another 4 or 6 fields this year. So if there's anybody in the room that wants to be part of this, feel free to talk to me afterwards, and we can definitely explore that a little bit more.
Ryan, on your previous page, so how does that release curve, does the BNA you referred to earlier, does that affect the release?
Very good question. BNA does a really poor job of predicting release from legumes. BNA really only does a good job of predicting release from applied manure or resident organic matter. So in the trials we've done so far, it does a pretty good job of saying, okay, based on the amount of organic matter you have in the soil, which includes manure you put on the soil, because manure is organic matter,
yeah.
What is the release on that? What's the potential for release on that? But it doesn't do a good job of measuring these legumes. At least not when we do it in the fall.
Right.
So we kind of have to look at those two things separately. I talked about manure. So who has manure in any part of their potato rotation? Couple, 2 or 3. This calculator was developed by the province. It's available on the agronomy website or the department website, or I can email it to you. It's very simple to use. You just have to put in, all the stuff you put in is here. And that comes from, that's your rate. This all comes from your manure test, or if you don't have a manure test, from a book value of, beef manure is generally on average worth blank, 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 and you put that in. You should always have a manure test if you can, but if you don't, you can get that from book values. Incorporation values based on if it was liquid and when it was incorporated, because if it was liquid, you could lose, some of it. It's less, it's not as big of a worry with solid. And then your nitrogen coefficient value is basically when it was applied, what time of year, and that has a little bit of effect on the nitrogen curve as well. But this will help you calculate it. And so if you put manure on the year of potatoes in the spring, say before you planted, you get next to no nitrogen credit that year. I think I did the calculation for this, and it was about 2 pounds an acre at 10 ton an acre of manure. But if you put it on the year before, you get 10 to 20 pounds of nitrogen an acre, depending on what it is. And then the next year after that, it actually goes up to 20 to 30. So your nitrogen release curve takes a while. It's more like a bell curve in terms of when that releases, and it takes about 18 months to kind of hit its maximum. But this is a good thing to do. But if you say you're working with somebody that has liquid manure, trading land with a dairy farmer, and they're putting liquid manure on, well, that's almost entirely immediately available, and those numbers can actually be pretty significant. So at home, we have dairy cows, put a tank of liquid manure onto the acre, ahead of my corn or something like that. That's worth 40 or 50 pounds an acre of nitrogen. So that's math that's worth doing, right, to balance it all out. And then how do we factor in the timing of release? So we talked about the timing of release for organic matter, the timing of release for legumes. It depends on incorporation. It depends on temperature in the soil. It depends on a bunch of different things. How do we influence the timing of release when it comes to actual applied fertilizer? So now we have new products available that either inhibit the breakdown of nitrogen to plant available forms through inhibitors, or that delay the release of nitrogen through coatings. So there's really 2 main classes here, okay? So there's your agritanes and super U's and those type of products, which are basically ureas with an inhibitor added, either a urease inhibitor that slows the breakdown from urea to ammonium, or a nitrification inhibitor which slows the breakdown from ammonium to nitrate, okay? 2 different types of inhibitors. Something like Super U has both inhibitors, but like say basic Agritane just has the urease inhibitor. Agritane plus, both inhibitors. So again, just depends on what product. There's lots of products available out here now on the inhibitor field. Not all are available in PEI, but there's single inhibitor and dual inhibitor products, and you have to kind of know what you have, and that helps with figuring out this release of nitrogen. So the inhibitors help slow that release and protect it from being lost early in the season. Then you've got your coated, so that's your ESNs or your pure yields, those type of products. They've got a polymer coating on them, and then that just breaks down over time and releases urea from the prill more slowly, okay? So those are kind of the 2 types of products. These products have been intensively trialed locally for more than a decade. And continually, we have seen that there is no yield penalty with using these. And yes, they cost a little bit more money, but you can offset the cost of the extra money by using a little bit less total nitrogen. So you can use a little bit less total nitrogen for about the same cost as what you were doing before. And the nitrogen, the less nitrogen you're using is just basically, you're not applying nitrogen that was going to be lost anyway. So the same amount of nitrogen is available to the plant, it's just that extra 15 or 20 pounds that you lowered your rate by is what probably would have been lost because the nitrogen was available too early and was available early in the season. So you're using less total pounds. You may not have changed your blend price too much, but it's going to be more available, and it's going to be more resident when your crop needs it later in the season.
Ryan, just on the manure there for a sec, you said with the solid manure, you get kind of the most, there's a bunch there the following year after you apply and the year after that. Do you think it's the same with the liquid manure, or is it kind of gone that?
No, liquid manure, so it depends on, when you do your test, there's total nitrogen and there's ammonium nitrogen. Okay, so that's the important thing to look at, and you should always, when you do a nitrogen manure test, always make sure you get the ammonium package. It's like $1 more. But you need that information because, so if my manure comes back and it says it's, 0.14 nitrogen, but it's 0.12 ammonium, that means that it's about 80–90% available right away. Because that ammonium is going to hit the soil and it's going to get converted into nitrate fairly quickly, and it's going to be available to the crop. But if it's 0.14 nitrogen and it's 0.01 ammonium, that means that there's very little ammonium in there, and most of the nitrogen is from the organic matter, and that takes time to mineralize. So that's where it takes like a year and a half, 2 years to fully, to really get the most value out of it. So if you're in potatoes and you've got solid manure, you'd better to put it on, the middle of the year before potatoes than even in the fall or right before, because you get more nitrogen release out of it. It takes time to break that organic matter down. So this is some work that Steve Watts and Dal AC and the department worked on Super U over 3 or 4 years as part of Living Labs, and you guys have probably seen some of this data before. But basically they were comparing this grower standard practice nitrogen, their normal rate of nitrogen with no Super U or slow release nitrogen, with same total pounds of nitrogen as their GSP, but with 30% of the nitrogen being Super U, or they lowered the nitrogen by total nitrogen by say about 15%, but again, 30% of the total applied nitrogen is Super U. And what they found over 18 site years of data is no difference in yield. There was some individual fields where the yield went up with the Super U's, mostly because there were either really wet springs, where there was a potential for nitrogen to be lost, or it was there was challenges with the weather later in the season. Again, that this availability was better. But on average, again, there was no yield penalty of using these products. And then the big thing is, on average, they reduced GHG emissions by 60%. And that's huge. So it's not huge for your pocketbook. Basically, this Super U low and this grower standard practice cost the same amount of money. So it does not change in your fertilizer bill that much in the short term. But what it does mean is that you're not losing nitrogen that's just lost to the system. It's not wasted at the end of the system. And it's less nitrous oxide that's going off into the atmosphere. And there will be a day very shortly where you'll be able to put this into carbon credits. Because that's a major source of greenhouse gas that you're eliminating just by reducing your fertilizer use or by having your fertilizer use be smarter. So you haven't really changed your bottom line on your fertilizer bill, but you've avoided waste, and that waste has a value. And that's where we're going to get to. You're probably in the not too distant future.
Ryan, what's the timing and method for applying the Super U?
You can put it in your blend. You can put it, a lot of people put it on like pre-applied, like broadcast spread ahead of the planter. I probably wouldn't put it as a top dress, because then you're probably a little bit too late.
Yeah.
But you can put it in your blend, and you can put it in your pre-apply.
Yeah.
Any other questions about this? So here are some of your fertilizer options. Thank you, Bernie, for helping me with some of the list of what's available from Agri. You got your basic urea, your 4600, with or without your inhibitor. So agrotane, as I said, if you're, say, applying to the soil, like on the surface of the soil, you want an inhibitor, because that'll make sure that it's not going to get lost, if it doesn't rain or something doesn't get soaked into the soil right away. Take some of that risk out of applying urea. Your Axan and your cans, these are your replacements for your old ammonium nitrate, right? They are ammonium nitrate stabilized by calcium. So that's why they have a lower amount than the old ammonium nitrate in terms of the amount of nitrogen in the product because they got some of this calcium in there. Your Super U is basically urea with dual inhibitors. Your ESN, your pure yield, that's urea with the coating. Then you got your ammonium sulfates, your Amidos, which is urea plus ammonium sulfate, your calcium nitrates. So Nitrivore is calcium nitrate with boron, but this is all of the nitrogen in this product is nitrate, and it's available immediately. So that's where, you know, it can be a valuable product for you depending on when you're applying it, but it's be more timed around a top dress, you know, when the crop is even up and getting going, than as a part of a blend or a pre-plant, because that nitrate is really vulnerable to loss. So it's just about timing. And calcium nitrate is often the product that's put, either that or UAN is what's put on through fertigation, you know. And then you got your foliar products, so your last end, length end, SRN, those type of products that are, you know, you can put on with the sprayer if you feel like, oh man, I've had a really good year, the crop's in really great shape, but I want to keep it rolling. I've got a variety that needs a little more nitrogen. That's something you can, a product you have. And you're only putting little bits on at a time, but it's an option. So some local nitrogen trial data to kind of bring some of these messages home. This was a Living Labs trial that Tobin Stetson did, along with John Phillips of the East Prince Group, and Yafang helped them a bit. And the greater trial was looking at irrigation. But within the irrigation trial, within these sites, they had these last two rows is what I want to draw your attention to. So these both had the same irrigation schedule and were irrigated the same amount of water at the same time, right? So that was the only difference between them, is that this one had 100% of the regular amount of nitrogen, and this one had 80% of the regular amount of nitrogen, and there's no difference in yield. You know, we're within 500 weight, you know, like there's no difference in yield, there's no difference in quality. The only difference, the only statistically significant difference was they had a 44% reduction in residual nitrates where they had reduced the nitrogen, and they only had a 30% where they had 100%, compared to dry land where you would obviously have more nitrogen left over because it had less water and more potential for residual nitrogen. So what does this tell you? That extra 20% of the nitrogen on these farms on average was surplus to need, and it was left over at the end of the season. So again, how do we make sure we're dialing in to use only the nitrogen we need and the nitrogen that the plants can take up, and not have it left over at the end of the season? Because if it's left over at the end of the season, this is the question we got yesterday. Well, you know, will the next crop use it? In PEI, our soils, sandy soils with lots of precipitation in the fall and warmer falls, 90% of nitrogen in nitrate form is flushed out the system. Either nitrates are going into the water or nitrous oxide going into the air. So you can't bank on that hanging around.
So a winter wheat crop wouldn't take some of that up?
A winter wheat crop would take some of that up because you've got something actively growing after potatoes. So if you've got a system where you can put winter wheat in after potatoes, yes, that will use some of that residual nitrate. Won't use all of it, it'll use a chunk of it. But if it's going to be a field that's just going to be bare, or it's harvested the 15th of October and you're only getting rye and the rye is only getting this big, it's only going to take up a small amount of nitrogen.
Ryan, the difference in the scheduled nitrogen is 20%, and the difference of residual nitrate is
15% a difference from the base, which was the dry land.
So those two numbers correlated?
Yeah. So where we use less nitrogen, the amount of residual nitrate was less. Yeah.
What's the difference between farmer irrigated and 100%?
Oh, this was basically how the farmer would normally irrigate, and an irrigation schedule based on soil moisture testing and that sort of thing.
And Tobin answered that
Yeah,
question.
Tobin noted that basically there was no difference in that either. So how the farmers were irrigating was basically meeting the needs of the crop. Okay. We've also done a number of trials in the last 4 to 5 years on looking at reducing nitrogen in seed. Because again, and this is getting driven home especially the last couple of years, we're seeing green peach aphids coming in earlier and earlier. This year they showed up in July. They showed up in Maine in June, which is like earlier than ever. And they are the prime transmitter of virus, particularly TBY, but they're also, if we start seeing more green peach coming in, we'll probably start seeing a return to leaf roll as well, because they're a prime vector for leaf roll. So we're going to be looking at top killing our seed earlier and earlier, right? And you want most of that seed dead by the end of August. But if we want our seed dead by the end of August, we don't want it to be at 200 hundredweight. We don't want to have no seed. So we want to make sure that that seed is finishing its life cycle and is tuberizing earlier than your other crops, and so that there's sufficient seed there when you go to kill it. And that you're not having to beat the brains out of it to get it to die in late August, early September. You're not having to put 2 and 3 rounds of Reglone on it, and maybe even flail chopping or whatever you need to do to get it dead. You want it to be starting to go down on its own, and then just maybe have to put one application of Reglone on it, hopefully to get it to die. In an ideal world. So we did 13 trials over 4 years, and we saw no yield penalty by decreasing nitrogen on seed by somewhere between 20 and 30%. This is a table that shows all of the trials that I did with growers. Some of these are from down east. A bunch of these in 2020 and 2019 are from down east. Some of these are from up west, some are from East Prince, so we're all over the province, okay? But basically what I can say is, when I average them all out, we're within 600 weight on total yield, with between 20 and 30% less nitrogen. Not every trial is the same. Some started higher, some started lower. Like here, the last couple of years, I've had some where the starting rate was 100 and they went to 80 or 70, and we still didn't see a difference. And in this one, actually, in Dakotas last year, they went down 20 to 80, and we saw actually this was statistically higher yield. You know, this one here, Mountain Gems 2023, this was statistically higher yield because we upped our sampling frequency by going down 25%. So this is enough data for me to tell you that there is not a yield penalty by having your nitrogen rate for your seed somewhere or around 100 pounds an acre. In and about 100 pounds an acre. And much more than that is likely going to be surplus to need, it's going to be left over, or it's going to delay the maturity of your seed, and you're going to have problems with getting your seed killed, and you may not have as many tubers as you want. And you may have problems with skimming and all those sort of things, and especially some of these newer varieties, Mountain Gems and Payettes and things that don't like to be handled rough, and they need to have set skins on them to not get fusarium and that sort of stuff. You know, that's pretty important too. And these Alverstones last year, or 2022 was a great growing season, but you can see 80 pounds of applied nitrogen, 394 hundredweight on seed that was killed the 1st of September. You know, like, remember when I said 400 hundredweight needs 200 pounds an acre of nitrogen? We only put on 80, so we got 120 from somewhere. Where's it getting it? Last year's clover crop, or last year's alfalfa crop, or residual from the organic matter, or whatever, right? So it doesn't all come from the fertilizer. Any questions about this? This makes sense? Yeah.
Was this like a big scale field trial or just one row?
No big scale field trial. Most of them were either split fields or 2 or 3 planter passes, and then I do like sample either side, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Brian, was there any correlation as to what these were following?
There's a mix here. So some are following legumes and some are not. So this Mountain Gem one here and this Dakota one here, these had higher rates to begin with because they weren't following legumes. They were following like mustard or Sudan grass or something like that. So then we didn't figure there'd be any nitrogen. And this is what the grower's standard rate was. This year, and this happens to be the same grower, okay? So 2022 was Dakotas, Their regular rate was essentially what their commercial rate was. And we put it down 20%, and they had the same yield, same number of tubers. So they took that information, decreased the Mountain Gems this year to 150, decreased their base rate. We decreased it another 25%, and we actually got more yield and more tubers. So, tells you that 177 was way too high, and 150 is still too high. And the real right number for this variety, probably somewhere in that 100 to 120 range.
So Ryan, does the type of nitrogen you put on affect? Like whether
It's more,
nitrate
again, I think it's more that release timing, right? So, whether the nitrogen is going to be available when you need it. You don't want to have it be, again, for seed, you want to have that tuberization happen a little bit earlier. You want to have it start to set tubers a little bit earlier so that it matures a little earlier. You're still only dealing with 90 to 100 days, so most of the products that were on, sorry, went the wrong way. Most of the products that were on this list, still, like, there's not going to be massive differences. Anything with nitrate in the name is more available immediately. So, like, your Axans, your calcium nitrates, you know, your cans, more of that nitrogen's available immediately. But you don't need nitrogen immediately when you plant potatoes, right? Because they live off the seed beets for the first 2 or 3 weeks that they're coming out of the ground.
Until they come out of the ground.
Yeah, and then that's when they start uptaking nitrogen. But the peak nitrogen for potatoes is at like flowering and after that, like at early bulking. That's when the peak nitrogen uptake for potatoes is. So you want to have more of your nitrogen available then. They need some early. They need more later. So, summary on nitrogen. Multiple years of local trials, and this is just some of the ones that I have. There's lots more, and they basically all tell the same story, is that generally nitrogen is not a limiting nutrient for most fields. Not for all fields. Low organic matter fields, super sandy fields, fields without a history of any manure, fields without a history of any legumes, will need more nitrogen. But that's just about accounting for all those sources, right? We've seen huge yields in recent years in some of these new varieties with lower amounts of nitrogen. I showed you that 80 pounds of nitrogen had 400 hundredweight dollar stones. 2 years ago, people were telling me I had 500 hundredweight on Mountain Gems, and my N rate was 120, 130. So as long as it's getting the nitrogen from somewhere, it doesn't have to come from the fertilizer, as long as you've got the other pool of it. But if you have a low organic matter field, and you didn't have any manure on there, and you didn't grow clover or alfalfa in it last year, well, you're going to have to put on more than 100 pounds of nitrogen, 120 pounds of nitrogen, because it's got to go from somewhere. So you need to factor in all these sources. And the slow release options do not have a yield penalty. And they allow you to decrease your total rate by enough to make up for the extra cost of the fertilizer. And I really am a big supporter and a big proponent of these options. We use them on our own farm at home on our corn. And last year, I think we saw a really big boost on them on corn. I used pure yield in ours for our corn. And because we wanted that delay until summer when they really need the corn, really need the nitrogen. And then we got all that rain in June and that sort of thing. And we didn't wash away all that nitrogen. You know, and I think, you know, we had really good corn yields last year, and I think part of it is because I think 40 to 50% of our blend was pure yield last year. So, also
eligible.
What's
that?
Oh, yes, yeah. Who's done anything with off-calf with the Federation? Few. If you haven't already, there will be another intake happening this spring, probably March. You'll start hearing about it for April. Under off-calf, you can get funding of up to $75,000 per farm to cover the cost difference between your slow release nitrogens and your regular nitrogens. So all you need is talk to Bernadette or whoever you get your fertilizer from, and you say, here's my blend with Super U, or here's my nitrogen program with Super U. What would the price be if I didn't have Super U, if I just used regular urea? And you take that difference, And then you can get 85% of this from this program, up to $75,000. So that's worth some paperwork. And it's not that much paperwork if you're doing something like that. There are other things covered in off-cap too. There's cover cropping, and there's other nitrogen management projects, and there's sometimes you can even get equipment for spreaders and things like that. But that's just an easy example. If you want an easy example of how to get money out of the program, that's an incentive for using those products. More work needs to be done on this legume end contribution. I'm pretty confident that if you had a good crop of alfalfa, that's worth 50 pounds of nitrogen next year, if you terminate it in the fall, or late summer, early fall. I'm pretty confident on that, based on what I've seen in other places, what I've seen in some of the past trial work we've done. Like even comparing it to clover, we did some trial work in Ames, and we had 30, 40 hundredweight more where we had alfalfa than where we had clover, because we get more nitrogen mineralization from the alfalfa than we do the clover. But regardless of whether you're using either or you've got those in, say, a multi-species mix, depending on how much is in your mix, you need to be accounting for this. You need to be accounting for this. And we can talk about what that is for you, depending again on your soil and depending on what's in your mix. If clovers and alfalfa are 20% of a mix, you're going to have less credit than if it's, 80-20 alfalfa timothy or something, right? But that's something we need to do more work on, and we are doing more work on. Only apply the nitrogen you need. Don't spend money on nitrogen that's just going to be wasted. My mantra isn't here, just use less nitrogen. It's use the nitrogen you need. And if that means you need a little better product, or a little different product, or you need the timing to be a little different, or you want to look at top dressing, or whatever, it's about using the nitrogen you need and not having it left over. Because you don't want to pay for something you don't need.
Talking on alfalfa, any thoughts? Our experience in underseeding alfalfa with the cereal is the year after the cereal, you get somewhat of a stand of alfalfa, but not much. The only time we have any luck is if you leave it out for a 4-year rotation and gets next year. Otherwise, we just don't get much of a stand if we're trying to get a yield of cereal as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't get a yield of cereal, it's not much use doing it.
So my experience with alfalfa is based on growing alfalfa at home, as well as working with some other growers that grow alfalfa as well. There are growers that do have really good stands of alfalfa. The growers that have the best stands of alfalfa is usually on a little bit higher pH soils, so 6 and above, 5, 8 and above. And where you've got sufficient calcium, alfalfa needs calcium. Alfalfa needs a bit of boron, so really, really low boron soils could be a problem. And a big part of it is the herbicide program on the grain. Because I've had a lot of folks that are new to alfalfa just spray with MCPA, and then that takes out half to 2/3 of the alfalfa. So you need to be looking at something like Impitox or Cobitox or something like that.
Can you get Impitox now?
Yep, it was real tight there in 2022, but it's more available now. We didn't have a problem getting it last year. And if you want to make it go a little further, and if you want to have it with a little better coverage, mix it with some soybean oil. And that really works. But it is way lighter on the alfalfa. And I know at home, on our new meadows, as we call them, on the alfalfa after grain, that's often our best alfalfa.
And that has been our issue in the past.
Yeah. So that would be, I would say, the herbicide, the pH, even sometimes the variety of alfalfa. Not all alfalfa is created equal too, right? So
And your potash.
and your potash. That's a big one too. Alfalfa needs potash.
Chris, on my farm, I was having, my alfalfa stands seem to be dropping off over time. And did some soil samples in the places where the alfalfa was coarse, my potash numbers were dropping in those fields and the pH was off.
Yeah.
And I already did the herbicide program with this. It's absolutely game changing
Yeah, that's a lot of big issue with us too.
with the soybean oil.
We're going to talk a little bit about potash in a minute, so we can talk a little bit about that too, in terms of amounts and that sort of stuff. Any other questions on nitrogen? This kind of making sense? Anything anybody doesn't agree on?
No, not that I don't agree.
No. Oh, I want to hear those conversations too, but go ahead.
You were saying the in credits, so how long are those in credits available before they're gone as well, like saying?
So for like a legume,
Yeah, like you're showing the credit that's being available, but how long is it available for?
the year after.
Year
It's
after.
not a multi-year, not usually.
Like it doesn't stay, I feel like it disappears too, so yeah.
It mineralizes, and if it's not uptaken, it's gone.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
okay.
So if you had, in the case of something that was mineralized, that you plowed in the spring, that only half mineralized by the fall, there might be a little carryover to next year, especially if you had a cover crop or something like that, but for all intents and purposes, it's a 1-year credit. But that's where the credits from things like, the credits from organic matter, that's an annual credit. Like, there's always mineralization in your organic matter happening, right? So that's an annual credit. The stuff that's come from manure, that's a, depending on the type of manure, that's a, 2 to 3, 4-year curve of credit. And it changes by the year. And that's in that kind of calculator, right? So.
Further to Chris's questions and comments with regards to alfalfa, there's some folks now in East Prince who have been using alfalfa as an underseed for years, and they're just not all that happy about it, and they've been going to no underseed and seeding the alfalfa directly the next spring early, and then harvest, and these are dairy guys, so the alfalfa is uber important to them, and they're harvesting lovely alfalfa a little later in the summer, and they haven't hurt their small grain yield at all with the underseed, and we all know how much more enjoyable combine.
Or, and also like that would be, that's not working for you, and you want it, your grain, and you don't want to underseed because it's not working well, then the next year could be direct seeded grass legume mix with an annual clover, like a crimson clover or something like that, which still fixes a fair amount of nitrogen, but it'll be more competitive early in the season.
That's a lot of months of not having anything green.
No, but you could have a cheap cover in after the grain or something like that, right? Like you could just spread oats on it or something, or re-spread some barley on it or something to have something green up that would have a cover, or something like that. In my world, the underseed's always the best situation. It's always probably the gold standard for ground cover, for nitrogen fixation, for saving trips over the field. But I acknowledge that there's fields and there's circumstances where it doesn't work, so if that doesn't work, there's other options.
Ron, on the alfalfa, is there any information on how short you can cut it, or how low does that hamper the regrowth?
Alfalfa can withstand pretty short cutting, way shorter than like your Sudan grasses and some of those other grasses. You want to you don't want to shave the ground, but it can withstand a lot shorter cutting than a lot of other things.
But your normal procedure seems to be okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to talk about phosphorus now. So, phosphorus, what does it do? It's a key component in DNA and RNA. We talked about ATP and ADP before. The P in ATP and ADP is phosphorus. So like it is a key component of those molecules for energy transfer. The thing you probably hear the most from people like me or agronomists you work with is P is really essential to root development. So it's very important early in the season for early root development in the crop. And it's also linked to better stalk and stem strength. So whether that's in your potato crop, stronger, healthier stalks coming out of the ground. We always heard, probably a lot of you heard over the years, the recommendation you want early P on grain crops so that you get good strong straw that's not going to lodge, that sort of stuff, right? Plants that are deficient in P, often they have this purple look. So I don't know how well this shows up. There's a bit of a tinge of purple on this. These were prospects last year that were, again, cold soil, super sandy. There's probably lots of P in the soil, but based on, like this would be about a 5.5, 5.4 pH field. So all the recipe, all the conditions are right in that field for that early season for that plant to be P deficient, so that's kind of purple. A week later it was gone, like a week later it was fine. But that's an example of some of that early purpling. You see it on other crops, you see it on, I saw it on rye at home last year that we had like after potatoes on kind of sour ground, there's a real purple tinge to the rye. Grew out of it a week later, but it is what it is. Now, the story with phosphorus is we use a lot less, the crop uses a lot less of it than it does of nitrogen and potassium. A 400 hundredweight crop of potatoes only exports 60 pounds an acre of phosphorus out of the ground. It needs another 20, so it needs a total of 80, and that 20 is going to go back into the ground again. So it only takes 60 out of the field. Now, the story on P has always been, we've always been told, well, yeah, there's lots of phosphorus, but it's not all available. There's lots of phosphorus, but it's not all available. There is truth to that, but it's a little more complex than that too. So, who's seen this chart or something like it before? Not many. Phosphorus is tied up by base metals at different pHs. So if really sour soil, so stuff that was, used to be woods not too long ago, or blueberry fields or something like that, it's highly fixed by iron. But we're not too worried about that because, we're not growing potatoes in 4 organic matter soil. What we're worried about between 5 and 6 is this high fixation by aluminum, and we have lots of aluminum in our soil. But the peak of fixation is at about 5.5. 5.5 is where most of us had most of our potato fields for a long time because we were worried about scab. And so it made sense that we probably over-applied phosphorus because it's a lot less available at that level. But what you can see is you don't have to go far after that peak and the availability gets way better real fast. Even in the high 5s, it's, 50% more available than it was before, and then you get to about 6 and it's about 2/3, 70% more available than it was before. So if you've got more of your fields at 5.8, 5.9, 6, 6.1 than you had at 5.5, you've got way more availability of phosphorus than if you're at 5.4, 5.5. Interestingly enough, if we were, say, in Ontario or out west where they actually start getting into alkali soils, then you actually start getting fixation by calcium. But again, that's not an issue what we have here. What we're seeing now is a lot of potato fields with 500 ppm plus on P2O5. That is 1,000 pounds an acre of phosphorus, of phosphate. Okay? And I said that a crop only takes 60 out of the field. It takes a while to whittle that down. And it's been building up because if you apply 160 every year and the crop only takes out 60, that's 100 going in every 3 years. And then depending on what you put on your barley crop or what you put on your other crops, you could keep building and building and building and building. Why is that a problem? Too much phosphorus doesn't impact the crop. It isn't a negative on the crop like too much nitrogen is. But it's an environmental problem. In Ontario and in Great Lakes, USA, and things like that, they're going ballistic with farmers that have soil test levels at 1/4 of this. And they're getting regulated as to how much phosphorus they can use, and they're getting regulated as where they can put their manure, they get regulated the timing of when they can apply manure, all those sorts of things. We want to avoid that here. We don't want that world here. We need to be more responsible with how we're using phosphorus, while not impacting our crops. So the story is, how do we find that balance? So there's a lot of work done in the last 7 or 8 years, mostly by Ag Canada, but with some other partners as well. I don't know, did anybody in the room do any of these trials? I know they did about 23, Alvin, you guys did? There's a bunch of people over the island that did. And basically what they saw, using this P to aluminum ratio, which is on your soil tests, where in the trials, where the P to aluminum ratio was 10 or higher, the optimum P rate was 0. There was no difference in yield between using 0 P and using standard P or a reduced P or whatever, that sort of thing. When this aluminum ratio was 5 to 10, the optimum P rate was 160. So that tells you, at these rates, more P is less available, more tied up, you need to apply more P. Now, are we comfortable saying that everybody with a 10 or higher aluminum ratio should use 0 P? Probably not. That's pretty bold. So this is what this is the PEI Soil Lab recommendations based on a pH above 5.5, and they're saying at 10 to 14, use 100. 14 to 16, use 75, and above that, use 50. But those are probably still even pretty conservative in terms of where things are. And your fields with pHs of 6 or higher, you have the opportunity to reduce EP even more, because based on that graph I showed you, you know, there's a big difference between 5.5 and 6 in terms of the amount of available phosphorus. So, just for graphing it out a little bit, this is from the PEI Soil Ag Quality Monitoring Program. The greens are less than 10. The yellows or oranges are 10 to 14 on this saturation P to aluminum ratio. The purples are 14 to 19, and the blues are 19. O'Leary, Helmsdale, Summerside, Bedeck, you know, Trackety, Surrey, Montague. Where we grow potatoes, they're all high. Where we don't grow potatoes, in the hills of Bonshaw and Fredericton and the woods here and the Arsend Lot 16 and the Squish Swamp, like it's a little different, right? So generally most of your fields, most of the samples I get back from trial fields are almost entirely over 10. There's very, very few that are under 10. If they're under 10, it's new land, it's land that you've taken in that's been in hay for ages, pasture land, that sort of stuff. But if it's been in a 3 or 4 year rotation of potatoes and other crops for a while, it's going to be 10 or higher. Almost entirely. So, some local research that was done. This is a trial that was done by Kyra with the Department of Ag. Again, 80, 160, 200 plus on P, no difference in yield. Actually, the best yield was at 80. Wasn't statistically different, but you can you throw a blanket over all of those. At 40, there was a significant difference. So 40 in this field wasn't enough. So they couldn't go 0. You couldn't go too low. You had to be some on there, right? 80 is basically the amount of removal, right? Or amount that's needed by the crop. So that seemed to work pretty well. This is one that a grower shared with me that they did on their own did with Cat Agri. They halved it. I mean, no difference. And this is a field that was a prime candidate. Almost 500 ppm, P2O5, P to aluminum ratio over 14. No difference. So they reduced P by 50% with last year's fertilizer prices on MAP, and factoring in that MAP's got nitrogen in it, that's worth about $50 an acre. So $50 an acre savings for no difference in yield, and doing something a little better environmentally. And to keep Bernadette happy, that's $50 an acre you can put into potassium. Because we're going to talk about potassium here in a second. But it's opportunities. You need to use the fertilizer you need. Don't use the fertilizer you don't need. Okay? And most of you have banks of phosphorus that have built up over 20, 30, 40 years that you could start mining. Right? So
3 generations of phosphorus.
Yeah.
Just poured onto the ground.
And if we don't, as an industry, get a hold of this, someone's going to get a hold of it for us.
Then you're going to be calling us saying you got to fight the government over this. We don't got the energy.
Like they're dealing with this down in Wisconsin. They're dealing with that in Wisconsin. They're dealing with this in Ontario. They're dealing with this in Minnesota. They're dealing with this in lots of places where they have lots of fresh water. Because when phosphorus moves to fresh water, it causes eutrophication in those freshwater bodies, kills fish, and it's bad news bears. So we need to be on top of that.
Ryan, them P levels, are they high generally across the island, or like a field that has never had potatoes, are you seeing them higher numbers?
No. So home, we bought a field 2 or 3 years ago that was part of our original home farm ages ago, bought it from the cousin or whatever, and that field had been pasture for 20 years. And the P in that was 40, right? Because all that had been going on that was cattle shit from grazing for 20 years. There'd been no fertilizer put on that field in 20 years. And if there was, it definitely wasn't phosphorus. So it was down, and it was deficient. And so, yeah, if you're gonna put potatoes in there, you'd wanna put 160 to 200 P probably on it. But in just 4 years of putting manure on that, and there's been 2 potato crops in there. I tested it again last fall. It's 150, you know, so it's gone up 3 times in 4 years. So it'll build quick. So,
What are your thoughts on cereal or a season-long cover crop for phosphorus?
season-long cover crop, don't put any on. There'll be lots for the crop. Your winter wheat or something, there's probably enough in the soil too, but if you want to put a bit in your starter blend at planting or something like that, again, P is important at the time, most important at the time of root development and early season, and especially if it's in cold soil. So you kind of got to do the math on that a little bit. It's like, am I planting into warm soil, cold soil? Do I think it's sufficient? That sort of thing. What's the pH in my field? That sort of stuff. So it's something to talk to your agronomist about, but like, you know, you're not going to put 1717 on barley, you know, because it's way too much phosphorus.
One of your bullets in your presentation, I think somewhere it's wrong, I seen yesterday, you said with regards to broadcasting.
Yes.
So if you're broadcasting fertilizer with any of those crops, Chris,
Yeah.
broadcasting P is a waste of money.
Yeah. Broadcasting P is generally a waste of money.
So, but if you're putting it down the drill, it makes sense to have some P there next year.
Real quick,
Seeds.
what are our P fertilizer options? You guys all know MAP and DAP, that's probably what most of you use. Here's your triple superphosphate as well, it's got some calcium in it. You know, your man-zinc phos, these in-furrow products, that sort of thing. Hydrophospholier, that's probably not used a lot in PEI, but because, again, we're not too problematic with phosphorus. Alpine is sometimes what people use as a starter, so they've actually replaced a lot of the phosphorus in their blend with a starter liquid P on the planter kit that gets that really super available phosphorus early in the season, gets out of the ground as a starter. A lot of corn guys go with stuff like this too. They don't have any foliar, they don't have any granular P in the box. They're just going with these liquids, right? So that's getting more and more popular all the time as these products get better and more refined and more researched and that sort of thing. So my summary on phosphorus. There's lots of evidence that you can significantly reduce P rates from what has previously been applied without harming the crop. The key is, the 2 main things is pH and this P to aluminum ratio. Look at those on your soil test. First of all, have soil tests. Then look at them on your soil tests. And then that should factor in what your P is going to be. Your liquid furrow starters are getting more and more popular. I'm seeing those kits on more and more planters all the time. I would recommend not mixing liquid phosphorus with fungicides and insecticides. That's a recipe for cement tanks. So do not do that. Broadcast P is a waste of money. Try your own trial. I'm going to be looking for a couple more growers this year that want to do this. Like, I want to have it in my field and see what it's like. And that's a spam call. Yeah, I want to have it and see what the difference is. You need someone to help you take that data? Let me know. Happy to help you with that. It's a pretty simple trial to set up. We can look at it. Any other questions about phosphorus before I move on to potassium? Okay, potassium. What does it do? Potassium is essential for almost all the key processes in growth and production. It helps to fortify plants. One thing we're going to talk a little bit about. K is really integral to water movement in the plant. So it is key for this opening and closing of stomata on the leaves, and it's also key for moving water up through the xylem and phloem, okay? So it's a key to water transport, and if you have a deficiency of K, that can affect how your plant uptakes water, particularly when water is a stress, so in times of drought. It's highly correlated with quality parameters like starch synthesis and deposition, so higher acidic gravity and higher starch amounts. And we need a lot of it. So, if your yield goal is 400 hundredweight or 350 hundredweight, you need to use a lot more K. You need about a pound of K availability for every hundredweight of potatoes you're going to grow. Now that doesn't mean you have to fertilize to that, because we still have to account what's coming from the soil, right? So you account from what's coming from your soil test. And this K that is in the above ground, that's going back into the system, right? So that's going to get recycled. You're not taking that off the field. You're taking this off the field. You're taking 260 off the field. So your fertilizer rate should at minimum keep up with the removal rate on potassium. And depending on your soil test, you may want it to be better than that. You may want it to be better than removal rate. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But we're into much bigger numbers than we were under N and P. Thankfully, K, unlike nitrogen, is not easily leached or lost from the system. So most of the K you apply, no matter when you apply, or if it's left over from last year's crop, or that sort of thing, or if you apply it this fall before, most, if not all of that K is going to be available the next year. Doesn't really leach. Only under really extreme scenarios have we seen it really leach or be lost from the system. K deficiency is highly correlated with yield. So remember what I said, like you need 1 pound per acre of availability for a hundredweight. Years and years and years and years, the relationship is linear. It's almost straight linear between K rates and yield. So, if you want yield, you need K. It's pretty straight math. You need to do the soil test. You need to know what you have in your field. If your K2O in your field is less than 100 parts per million, which is about 200 pounds an acre, for me, that's usually that's my danger line of, like, if I'm under 100, I'm probably gonna need to up my K rate and then add a little more to make sure I have enough. If you've got 200, 300, 400, because you're taking on, say, again, ground that's been getting lots of manure or something like that, well, then maybe you can back it off a little bit. That's something you can pay attention to. I have fields at home that, the field out behind the barn that always gets the manure or whatever else, and I'm into 450K, K2O, well, I'm gonna back my K off in my fertilizer blend. But you guys probably don't have a lot of 450 ppm K fields, unless it's something you're trading with a dairy farmer or something like that, a lazy dairy farmer. So,
Barrett's.
Yeah. So this is something that you need to pay attention to. KCL, we've talked about this a lot in the past, and a lot of you have already moved on this, is minimizing the KCL or the MOP in the planter blend, because too much MOP in the planter blend in the past has been associated with lower specific gravity because it's too much salt in that band, and high amount of salt index in the band restricts root growth, which restricts development, which can impact quality and starch deposition. So, nothing against KCL. KCL is a really good source of potash, but maybe consider it with pre-apply, broadcast, fall before, something like that. It's a great candidate for, VR, variable rate, if you want to do it that way. Make sure you got parts of the field that are getting a little more, a little less. Great option there, okay? But in your blend, a lot of people have taken a lot of the potash out of their blends for this very reason, and because there is lots of options to variable rate apply it before or the year before or whatever else, you're carrying a little less fertilizer in the plant, that sort of thing. So that's an option. So very prime candidate. Again, I get the question all the time, oh, am I okay to fall apply potash? 100%. You can put it on the summer before, put it on your alfalfa crop or your, whatever. Like, it's not really going anywhere. So your options, KCL, 0060, potassium sulfate, 0050 with sulfur, polysulfate, that's kind of a newer product the last few years. Cav Agri's got it. It's 14 potassium, but it's also 18 sulfur, 6 mag, and 17 calcium. So it's got those 4 key base metals in it. You've got your K-Mag, your 221122 here. You've got your Agri Potash liquid, that's a liquid source. There's other liquid fertilizer, liquid potash is available as well, like K-Max, that sort of thing. And then manure, that's a big one, that sometimes, again, we have to think about that same manure calculator I talked about. If you put on 10 tons of beef manure, basically, no matter when you put it on, that's worth 35 pounds an acre of potash, something like that.
That's 10 tons of
Fresh manure.
fresh?
Fresh manure. 6,000 gallons an acre of liquid manure, so that's like a tanker and a half of liquid manure. That's 100 pounds an acre of K2O and like dairy manure. You know, there's a lot in there, more than you'd think. So you can use this calculator to do that same thing with potash. And that build that into your system too, yeah.
So using K-mag and sulfate of potash, your sulfur levels really, like your sulfur amounts really creep up?
They should.
So what do you feel like it's safe to use? How much sulfur?
We're going to talk about sulfur after this.
Okay.
There isn't really a penalty to using too much sulfur either. And sulfur isn't as resident in the soil as other, it's a little bit more lower like nitrogen, it's more susceptible to losses. So you can't build sulfur in the way you can build potassium. But we're going to talk about sulfur a little bit more in just a second, okay?
Okay.
So those 100 pounds in that 6,000 gallon per acre tank, that's all available right away?
Mostly, yeah. Especially the liquid. Yeah. Maybe not fully available in the beef manure in the first year, but mostly. K is more available. What it says on your soil test, it's funny. If you look at your soil test, the K on your soil tests is usually not terrible far off the magnesium. Like they're usually in the same range, within 20, 30, 40 pounds an acre, or ppm on the soil test. But your K is way more available than your magnesium is. Way more. And then your calcium, which we're going to talk about in a second, calcium's like 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 sometimes, and a very tiny fraction of it's available. So it's a little different story. Now thankfully magnesium and calcium seems we need a lot less, whereas K is a lot more, seems we need more, but it's a little more available. I get a lot of questions about how much should I sell straw? Should I sell hay? What's that worth? What should I be charging for hay? I did this calculator. It's available on the website. I can email it to you. You can play around with it as much as you want. The only things that you really need to change on it is what it is. So in this I've got, it's like barley straw, wheat straw, oat straw, clover hay, alfalfa hay, silage, alfalfa claims, like if you're doing it, if they're taking it off as silage. I think I have sandgrass in there. I have a couple different things in there. And it basically calculates the removal of those nutrients and then also puts a dollar on it. These are like last year's prices approximately for those components. They'll be different this year. They'll be different every year. All you have to do is update those, or I can update those. But this calculator just basically calculates how much nutrients are removed by those different crops, at what removal, at what you're taking off the field, and then what value does that have. So based on last year's fertilizer prices, a bale of straw that's coming off the field is worth $14 in just phosphorus and K, and the K is the majority of that. The K is like $12.50 to $13 of that. 5 bales of the acre of barley straw removes 70 pounds an acre of K. 4 bales of the acre of alfalfa hay removes 83, 85 pounds an acre of K. Clover's probably somewhere in the middle, probably somewhere around 78 to 80. It's fine to sell hay and straw. I'm not saying don't sell hay and straw, and my dairy farmer dad says, please sell hay and straw. There's no problem with selling hay and straw. And from an organic matter standpoint, there isn't a problem with selling hay and straw. But just make sure you're accounting for this. Now, if you're selling straw for $12 a bale, then baling it, you're only just barely, not even covering the cost of the K. And besides anything else.
That's roughly where the market is, though.
Yeah, I know.
Progressive areas.
But I'm just telling you, like, if you're trying to balance it out, and so that may be the case where I'm trading land, or I'm getting manure, and then you can also, I have a manure calculator as well, on the website as well. So if you want to say, 100 bales of straw is worth this much manure, then you can kind of marry them up and that sort of thing, if you don't want cash to change hands and that sort of stuff. So there's some tools to figure this out, but you just need to understand what you're losing in the situation. And if you, more than anything, maybe it works operationally for you to keep your relationships, to sell straw a little cheaper, because that little bit of difference is worth you keeping the land or keeping your rotation or whatever else. Just know that regardless of what you're getting for straw, you need to replace this K. Yeah. Okay? That's the main thing. You need to replace that K.
So how much do you think a load of manure is worth in relative to the bales, I guess?
I'll send you my calculator.
There you go.
Changes by the prices of some of these sort of things, but I can send you that. It's on the agronomy site too. And so you can, again, that changes depending on what it is and how well rotted it is and the test on it and that sort of stuff, but yeah. So that's why, to answer some of these questions, I just sort of put a couple of these rough Excel calculators together. They're just Excel spreadsheets with 1 or 2 inputs, and then makes it a little bit easy. So, summary on potassium. Do not skimp on the K if you have high yield targets. If you've got, you know, your yield target's 300 hundredweight on seed or 250 on creamers or something, yeah, okay, you're not going to need as much K. But if you're on full season processing, mountain gems, and your yield target's 400 hundredweight, you need to be using sufficient K. If the soil test levels are good, which as I said is about 100 or more on the ppm, your K from your fertilizer and manure should equal your removal rate or better. There's lots of times here to apply K. If you're selling hay and straw, supplement your K. Insufficient K can make potatoes more vulnerable to drought stress. That hasn't been so much of an issue the last 2 or 3 years in BEI, but this, if you want to make sure your plants are a little bit more resilient to periods of drought, make sure they're not deficient in K. It's just one thing you can do. It's not, doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it less of a problem. Any other questions about potassium?
Is there any advantage or I guess disadvantage to broadcasting it versus putting it
No.
putting it in the hill?
Brian, in that question for potash, or for K, where does nitrogen fit in that same question?
It's not quite the same because nitrogen is really heavily, nitrogen is brought up by water and it's associated with how it can get water into the system. And often your timing of max nitrogen uptake is also when we're more likely to have drought stress. Whereas the timing of max, like the timing of max P uptake, or sorry, K uptake is late in the season at bulking. So having extra nitrogen doesn't help if there's no water to move the nitrogen, I guess is the story I'm telling you. So if you're into drought, there's more value in spoon feeding some nitrogen on foliarly than there is just having a lot of nitrogen in the soil that the plant can't actually use. And that's why we see, you know, a really dry year and we're digging in the hill after planting and we're still finding nitrogen pearls in there, right? So.
Any trials done with broadcasts like pre-plant K versus top dress K at hilling?
There has been some. The last, like Cavendish, Newton did some work with polysulfate this year that he'll have some results on probably by March, looking at it as a top dressed K as well as other nutrients at top dressing versus pre-apply, that sort of thing. Steve Watts has done a bunch of work with some of his growers the last few years on this polysulfate as well. Some of Steve's work seemed to show some advantage to the polysulfate at hilling compared to not, or compared to pre-apply, but I don't have the full data set there. So. When I was over in the UK here in the fall, talked to a bunch of growers and most of them were using polysulfate and they were doing it at hilling as well, and they liked it.
Okay.
Yeah. You're not getting a lot of K on then, you're getting some,
Yeah.
but then you're also getting the sulfur and the calcium is a big one because you're getting calcium in the tuber root zone as opposed to the plant root zone. So there's some benefits there. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Sulfur, we just talked about sulfur. What does it do? It's part of 2 essential amino acids necessary for chlorophyll, necessary for nodulation in legumes. For anybody that's growing brassicas, so your mustards and radishes and canolas and all those sorts, it's key for glucosinolates production, and glucosinolates is the chemicals that help beat down pests and diseases. So glucosinolates is what the wireworms eat and don't like and die, and that sort of thing. And it creates that isothiocyanate gas. And it's highly linked with nitrogen. So often, like we say, if you're doing mustard or something like that, you have a 5 or 6 to 1 nitrogen to sulfur rate. So if your nitrogen rate was, 100, you'd want at least 20 sulfur, something like that, you know. A major source of sulfur breakdown is from organic matter. So we talked about you get a little bit of organic matter breakdown every year. Every year you're getting some mineralization of sulfur with your organic matter, as you're also getting nitrogen. Low organic matter soils, or those without manure addition, will have less available source of sulfur. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Richer soils, you may have a lot of your sulfur needs from the soil. Poorer soils or less organic matter laden soils, probably considerably less. We used to get a bunch of free sulfur. We used to get free sulfur from acid rain. We don't get that anymore. That's a good thing for society and not a good thing for your guys' pocketbooks. We used to get more sulfur in bulk fertilizers. It used to be like when you get some of the old bulk fertilizer would have some impurities from the mining process. We just carry a bunch of sulfur with it. They do a much better job of that, so we don't have that sort of additional sulfur. We used to get some free sulfur in some of the pesticides we use, especially those like contact fungicides and stuff. Don't get that anymore. So, and then we also have crops like canola and mustard. If you have those in rotation, they're taking up more sulfur than some of the other crops as well. They have much higher sulfur needs than some of the other crops. So, sulfur is more likely to be deficient in sandy, low organic matter soils with high rainfall, and that is PEI to a T, you know, generally, like on a comparative basis, right? Low being 3% as opposed to 6 or 7% they have out west or something. So, now the story on sulfur is we don't remove anywhere near as much sulfur as we do like nitrogen and some of the other crops. So you only remove 12 pounds an acre of sulfur with 400 hundredweight potatoes. And you use another 8 in growing in the plant, so you need about 20. The plant needs about 20 pounds an acre. But again, like nitrogen, sulfur isn't 100% efficient. So just applying 20 is probably too low a number. It's very much too low a number. But, and we get it from other sources, so it's, you know, we're not quite as worried there. And I'm going to show you in sources, there's probably other opportunities to get sulfur. But this is how much the plant actually physically needs, but the availability and the efficiency at which it uses sulfur is a little bit different. But we get sulfur, like, you know, if you're using sulfate of potash, that's 18% sulfur, polysulfate, 18% sulfur, K-mag, 22% sulfur, ammonium sulfate, 24% sulfur, you know, gypsum is 18.5% sulfur. So we have lots of opportunities to get sulfur. There's lots of products that carry sulfur, depending on what you're doing in your blend, what you're doing with your, you know, if you're using gypsum, you're using, you know, doing pre-application of K-mag, that sort of thing. So, you know, use 200 pounds an acre of K-mag, you know, that's a fair jag of sulfur that you're putting on, right? So, it's something to just keep in mind, you know, you need sulfur. Most of us are probably getting enough sulfur from our blends, and if you're working with the agronomist, just make sure you don't want to forget about it, but 30, 35 pounds an acre, 40 pounds an acre, somewhere in that ballpark, depending on your yield goal, that's probably a good ballpark for sulfur. One thing I can tell you, there has been very little local research done on sulfur response, and that's probably an area we need to look at, because again, it wasn't a limiting nutrient for a long time, and it probably is a little more limiting now in certain fields, certain circumstances, so it's probably worth looking at. I can only find one potato study from recent past that talked about sulfur supplementation from Manitoba, and where they used no sulfur compared to where they added, I think, about 35 or 40 pounds an acre of sulfur, they had a 40 to 50 hundredweight yield improvement. And that's on the sandier soils near Carberry, so be somewhat similar to PEI, not high organic matter soils. But very little local research on this. If you use manure, you'll get extra sulfur in that too, so it's just something to kind of keep in mind as well. Any questions on sulfur?
Do you think there's a chance too much then?
I haven't really seen any studies or any talk about sulfur toxicity unless you're getting into really high levels. And like there's work out of Europe and other places where they used really high levels of sulfur to try and help with scab, because there was talk about it being in relation to scab. There's some studies that say it worked and some studies that say it didn't. But I know Newton used like 150 pounds an acre sulfur on trials at the research farm at Cavendish. No impact on yield, but all no impact on scab. So I don't really think there's a, unlike nitrogen, too much sulfur isn't really going to cause you a problem, but too much sulfur could also be a waste, right? Because as I said, it doesn't build up in soil the same way that K does or something like that. It's a little more transitory.
But what part of the crop stage do they require the most sulfur?
It's a little more steady. Like it's grows as the plant grows. It's not. I don't know that the peak is one exact time. It's a little bit more. Like it's not like K at bulking or N at early in tuberization, that sort of stuff. It's a little bit more spread to the system. Magnesium, as I showed you in that diagram on chlorophyll, every molecule of chlorophyll has an atom of magnesium at the center of it. It is part of the P carrying complex, and it's also a key for root development, so they work in synergy and early root development. You usually see deficiencies in magnesium, usually in the lower leaves, so you have to look at it a little bit when you're scouting, that sort of thing. We don't see magnesium deficiency that much in PEI because, again, generally, now that we have more products that have magnesium in them, and especially if you're using dolomitic lime or things like that, we don't see it that much, but you do see it once in a while. It's associated, it is slightly associated with K, and if you have excess K, sometimes you can depress magnesium uptake sometimes, but I doubt we have too many situations like that in PEI based on our growing conditions. So the interesting thing here is, compared to, again, most of the other things we were talking about, now we flip-flop. We don't take that much magnesium off with our potato crop, but the above ground plant uses twice as much. So this stuff keeps returning to the soil, which is great. So you're only actually transporting about 9 or 10 pounds of magnesium off with your crop. So based on what you're removing from the field every year, it's not that bad. This stuff's going to keep getting recycled and keep being used. But the crop needs 30 available pounds an acre of magnesium, to grow your crop. What are your sources? Again, your polysulfates, your K-mags. A lot of people do K-mag in the fall or using these polysulfate products and stuff. That's a really good source of mag. Your high mag lime or dolomitic lime, that's a source of mag. Foliar mag products are pretty common, a lot of, especially late season, that sort of thing. Those tend to be pretty, so that's polysulfate there, that picture. Used to be 20 years ago or so, it was basically dolomitic lime and not a whole lot else. So now you've got a lot more options on mag, right? Keyserite, another option. So depending on your soil test and your additions via lime and other sources, I would usually target your pounds of mag to be about 10% of your K rate, somewhere in that. So if your K rate is 250 pounds per acre, your mag should probably be about 25 or 30, something in that range. Again, depending on your soil test a little bit, right? Magnesium is not naturally overly high, but it's also, I wouldn't say, overly deficient. It's not like calcium, where we tend to have more of a deficiency, a natural deficiency. But the deficiency is more acute on low organic matter and low pH soils, sandy soils, that sort of thing. If you suspect deficiency, we do have foliar applications, and you put them on at full bloom, and then another 2 or 3 weeks later, and that usually does a pretty good job at that. So something to keep an eye on. But you have a tool in the toolbox if you do find that you're having an issue. Any comments on magnesium? Going through the last few a little quickly. I want to make sure we're not all day in here. Save my throat.
10:13.
10:13. We're doing well. Last and big one, calcium. What does calcium do? It is an essential structural component in building cell walls. And you've probably heard presentations in the past where calcium, we want to fortify tubers with calcium to make them more resistant to bruise and soft rock, and have them be to store better and have less shrink in the storage, less water loss. And those are all really valid things, and a lot of work done on calcium in potatoes over the last number of years. Again, interestingly, your tubers don't have much calcium in them. Really a lot less than the plant does. And all this plant calcium goes back into the soil. So you don't deplete calcium that much with your crop, with your potato crop. You deplete calcium with, if you harvested, you know, hay or something, that's going to take a lot of calcium out of the field. Like alfalfa takes a lot of calcium out of the field. But your actual potatoes don't take that much because potatoes are what? Mostly water and starch. There's no calcium in starch. So it's just the skin that's got the calcium in it, really, of any great amount. So, what are your calcium sources? Beyond lime, of course we all know you get the lime, but the calcium from lime takes longer to become available, so it's not as immediately available to the crop. And as I said before, you may have a soil test that says you got 1,000 ppm calcium, but a big amount of that is not immediately available to the crop. So if you want to look at something like polysulfate, your Axan and your cans, there's calcium in there. Your calcium nitrate, nitrobor, gypsum is about, what, 23% calcium? So there's other options for getting calcium into your crop, depending on what you're doing and what works for you. There's a fact sheet on the agronomy website that's based on, Dr. Palta was here in 2018 for the Potato Expo. It talked about calcium fortification of the tubers. And a lot of the work that they've done in Wisconsin over the last 20, 25 years or more, and basically showing that you can have all the calcium in the world in the root zone of the plant, but the plant won't move it into the tubers, or won't move enough of it into the tubers. You need to have the calcium in the tuber root zone, which is above, higher in the hill. And that's where you need the calcium availability to get into the tubers, and then the tubers take it up from tuber roots, not from the plant itself. Or not from the main plant root architecture, but from those tuber roots. And so, that's where they talked about, like, you know, if you just spread gypsum on ahead, it doesn't seem to be that effective. And multiple people have done trials on that here, and it doesn't seem to be that effective of driving calcium into the potatoes. But things like calcium nitrate has been. So whether that's calcium nitrate through fertigation or calcium nitrate at hilling time or something like that, that has been effective. That's why we're trying to do some of this work on polysulfate, whether having it at hilling and having it as a source that drives a little more calcium into the tubers. Because having more calcium in the tubers themselves is what protects them from this, you know, water loss and storage rots and all that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in that, there's a full 2-pager on this on the website you can take a look at, and it's all real relevant like that. The science hasn't changed on that in the last few years. So response and recommendations, I'd say the majority of your soil calcium is not available to the crop, but I wouldn't get too worried about that unless your calcium levels are really low. So if your calcium levels in your field are like 500, 600, 700, you're really going to need to up your calcium levels. If you're 1,000 or better, you're not in too bad a shape. Multiple studies in PEI have shown that gypsum is not associated with higher calcium in the tubers. If you have a low calcium soil and you don't want to change your pH, then gypsum's a good calcium source for just increasing your total calcium, but it's not going to drive calcium into the tubers. Certain varieties are more responsive to additional Ca, and to the inverse of that can be naturally deficient in calcium. So Newton was telling me yesterday about how they've seen calcium deficiency in prospects and shepherdis, where there wasn't quite enough calcium in their fertility program, and just those varieties seem to be a little bit deficient at bringing calcium into the tubers, and that can impact sprouting, particularly. Like you can even see little black ends on the sprouts if they've had this calcium deficiency. So some of those varieties, you may want to up your calcium in your program a little bit more. And most of the calcium uptake in potatoes will return to the soil, so you're not losing it. But again, if you've got a rotation where you're doing a lot of hay, you're doing a lot of corn silage, that sort of stuff, that's going to take a lot more calcium off the field. Micronutrients, I'm not going to talk about micros too much. Lots of people have their programs from micros. I'm not going to challenge orthodoxy too much on micros. Everybody knows what works for them. Pay attention to your soil test results. They will help you understand whether you have a deficiency or not. Most of the micros are not a big issue for PEI. The 3 biggies are boron, zinc, and manganese, and really boron and zinc, more than anything. Because manganese is deficient in some fields, not in others. Boron and zinc are deficient in almost every field. Like they're at low levels. I hardly ever see a high for zinc, and I don't think I've ever seen a high for boron on a soil test. So they're usually lacking. You usually have to supplement them in some fashion. The game changer for me has been now that we have these coatings available where you can coat every prill with boron and zinc as part of the coating, as opposed to just putting little bits of boron and zinc in the thing and hoping that your root happens to land next to one of them. That's, I think, a much better way of having boron and zinc availability. But boron and zinc and man, they're all used as foliar products too. A lot of you probably use boron in your with your sprays, especially later season, to control maturity and that sort of stuff and drive growth. Boron's not super expensive, you know, compared to some of the other products. So we talked about it a little bit the last couple of meetings. You know, I'd say there's a lot of people using boron in their sprays, and if it works for you, keep at it. Like it's, but pay attention to where you're at in terms of what you need and what's available. Boron does not accumulate, like you can't build boron. You know, you just can't. And you can't really build zinc either, like unless you're putting wax of it on, and then that gets real expensive. So you're better to kind of spoon feed these because they're needed in such tiny amounts, right? Like they're micronutrients for a reason. They're not, you don't use a lot. Overall recommendations. We do not live in a world anymore where insurance fertilizer makes sense. We haven't lived in that world for a while, but both economically and environmentally, you need to use what you need. There's very few nutrients that you can actually build in any real amount, and without lots of chances for losses too. K you can build, calcium you can build, magnesium you can kind of build, the other stuff, no. And we can build phosphorus, but we don't want to build phosphorus. So, on-farm nutrient trials are a great way to understand how it works on your farm, your rotation, your soils. If you want to try and dial in what your nitrogen rate should be, your phosphorus rate is, you know, that's something to try. You know, try figuring it out on half a field, a quarter of a field, a few strips in a field, see what's happening. If you have something like, if you got a yield monitor and climate field view or something like that, and you can visualize that data without doing strips, that's great. If you need someone to help you do strips, you know, give me a call or give somebody a call and we can help you figure that out too, okay? Different varieties respond slightly different to nutrient uptake. We all know that some varieties take more than others. Burbanks take more nitrogen than others. You know, Ivy Russes take more nitrogen than others. Some prospects take less than others. You know, so you have to pay attention to your variety sheets too in terms of understanding what those needs are. Soil sampling is fundamental to all of this. Everybody, please have every field sampled at least once a rotation, if not more often, because you need to know what you're dealing with to be able to know accurately what to put on. The costs of soil sampling are infinitesimal compared to the costs of over-applying or under-applying fertilizer. So that's really important to know. If you're worried, you really want to dial in your nitrogen, you know, one thing to try is post-harvest nitrate sampling. Just go in after you dig the potatoes and take a 12-inch core in a few different places and send it to the soil lab. It's about $20, and that'll give you a good idea how much leftover nitrogen is there. And if your numbers are 5, 10, 15 parts per million, you did a really good job of delivering the nitrogen to the crop that it needs, and there isn't a lot left over. If those numbers are 30, 40, 50, then that's a lot of leftover nitrogen. So, and that may be nitrogen you applied or nitrogen that was mineralized and you didn't account for. Pay attention to local research. I don't just say that because I do local research, but there's lots of people doing local research, and there's lots of good work that's been done over the last number of years, and we're doing it for your benefit. And I think there's a lot we learn on that speaks to what the realities of production is here. So I shared data thankfully provided to me by local researchers today, the department, Ag Canada, Steve Watts, Cavendish, different people, like, you know, take that on board as much as you can. More local work is needed. I talked about we need to dial in the nitrogen rates in some new varieties. We need to look at the legumes. We need to optimize these P rates. We need to maybe do some work on sulfur. This whole area of biostimulants, this is a whole different kettle of fish we're not going to talk about too much today. There's some work happening on this, but that's, yeah, we have a lot to figure out on that. higher organic matter levels, not only do they help with water holding capacity and buffering against stresses, but they also naturally deliver more nutrients. So if you have higher organic, 3% organic matter will deliver more nitrogen and more sulfur and more other nutrients and more microbes to your crop than 2% organic matter. So that's important to factor in, important to recognize, and they also then help, if you have leftover fertilizer and leftover nutrients, then by building organic matters, that does keep some of it. It's a small amount, but it does help sequester some of it and carry it over to the future. And just ensure that your agronomist is following a 4R approach. Like most of the agronomists at PEI are, or at least have done the training and that sort of thing. But really, you should be focusing, like, make sure when you're talking to your agronomist, you know, are you really paying attention to right source, right rate, right time, and right place? Because it's not just marketing. It is based on science. It's based on reality. It's based on you having the access to the fertilizer you need. And in a world where we get more and more attention to agriculture and environmental stewardship all the time, the more that we in agriculture and you as producers can make sure that you are aligned with 4R approaches, will take the heat off of you considerably when it comes to fertilizer use. So that's something that you can do and you and your agronomist can do to be proactive, to make sure you're not shorting yourself on fertilizer and you have access to what you want.